It started in the 1800s. The medical world was starting to get a bit experimental. That, combined with the Civil War and their limited understanding of bacteria and infections, led to some fairly unconventional practices. Let's just say that not all of their treatments worked as well as they thought they did. This is what many consider to be the age of human experimentation. But the experiments weren't the only problem. Another huge issue was cleanliness. They would often use unsterilized tools, leave some patients open to infection, and have terrible conditions for mental patients. That leads nicely into mental health. Many people were sent to the right place, mental institutions, where they would actually try to help people, but eventually those became full. So they created insane asylums, which were more like prisons than places that actually help people. In fact, many of the people who worked there became insane themselves. To deal with the wave of problems that come with insane asylums and medical practices in general, we should look from an inside point of view. Let's pretend you were sent to an insane asylum. You're probably confused as to why you're there. I mean, you're a completely normal person. And you are right. You are normal, but many normal people who would not at all be considered insane would be sent there. Why was this? Typically, to be sent to an insane asylum, you would have to meet a certain number of requirements on a list. If you had enough, you were considered insane. Let's take a look at one of these lists. Let's see. Indigestion, religious anxiety, loss of property, intense study, loss of children, concussion from explosion of steamboat, jealousy, shipwreck, fear of being killed by a mob, scurvy. Does something seem off about this list? That's probably because it's almost entirely unbacked by scientific evidence. It's almost as if they were like, hey, quick, we need an idea for a list for these insane asylums. Quick, first thing you think of. And that system does not work, as demonstrated by the number of non-mentally ill normal people that were locked up in insane asylums. Many patients went through extreme pain, mostly because anesthesia, the medicine used before surgery so you don't feel the pain, was not used until later in the 1800s, meaning patients enduring the extreme procedures felt every bit of pain they could. Another thing that came late was sterile blood transfusions. That meant if you needed blood because of blood loss of some kind, you would either have none and die, or have it unsanitized. It was also around this time that the polio virus began. And it wasn't until 1960 that the virus would be cured. Jumping back to 1945, we can see the drug penicillin B being issued orally. It was a helpful fighter against bacterial infections, and is still in other forms today. It was also the time period of World War II, which meant a lot of soldiers with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, being sent to insane asylums. And of course, by the 1950s, they came up with a, quote, cure for PTSD. They called it electric shock therapy. It was a lot like it sounded like. They would stimulate the frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for violence, with electricity. Another popular procedure was a lobotomy. The doctor would start by sticking an ice pick-shaped object called an orbitoclast into the top of the patient's eye. They would then strike through the soft bone with a hammer, repeat for the other eye, and they have successfully disconnected the prefrontal lobe from the rest of the brain. But after the 1950s, things started to die down. The rate of lobotomies performed dropped astronomically, probably for the better though, and insane asylums were shut down. But the past remains, and where there is history, there is something to be learned, and hopefully we can avoid similar situations in the future.